Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us as part of our Small Biz UAE webinar series. Over the last several weeks, we've been doing webinars to help startups deal with the COVID situation that's been going on. We've covered topics such as finance, fundraising, marketing, strategy, and also some more personal elements such as how to deal with leadership issues and challenges. And today we want to kind of take that discussion about startups and the situation that we face by moving to a more macro level with some of the newer industries that are coming under the spotlight. And one of them certainly is agriculture and the innovation within that space. And for this discussion, I'm excited to have with me Abdulaziz Mulla, who is the CEO and founder of Madar Farms. Welcome, Abdulaziz. Thank you for joining us. And if you could introduce yourself to the audience, please.
Thanks very much, Hisham, and always say assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thanks to Shara for organizing this, for giving us the opportunity to have a chat like this. So my name is Abdulaziz Mulla. I'm the CEO and founder of Madar Farms. We're a local AgTech startup focused on deploying the latest technologies to really address agriculture in a sustainable way. Started this 2 years ago now, but my lifestyle and my life story was definitely not one leading to this. But keeping minds open, and feel very lucky to be where we are today.
Fantastic. And, before we get into the discussion about Madar Farms and, AgriTech, I would like to discuss just briefly your background as an entrepreneur, because if I, understood correctly, you were in banking before and you kind of made that switch. And I always find that really fascinating. And I think the audience would be interested to know as well how you made that switch from corporate, because banking is a very, rigid, let's say, industry. And then it's like entrepreneurship. So how did you make that shift?
Yeah, it was definitely two extremes. I always say that life is a series of mistakes or opportunities, and mistakes are only missed opportunities. And I used to be in banking. I actually went back to school to do business school, and then I became a consultant. So I've worked in kind of two of the most, if you will, kind of structured environments. And shifting to this has definitely been a change. It wasn't really something that I had planned out, or wasn't something that, I'd been planning or dreaming about for a while. It was very much, I was working on a project at McKinsey focused on national security. And one of the things that we looked at was food security. And I always considered myself somewhat educated, aware, but I realized how little I knew about the problem and how bad and imminent the problem was. And it really was not so much a conscious decision, such as just a drive to see that, something was going wrong. And I felt very strongly that we could do it better. And I wouldn't say it was, a structured thought process. It was just this intense, overwhelming feeling that this was something that if I dedicated myself to, we could really move the needle and create true impact in the space. So that's really how it happened. I fell into it. It wasn't something that I planned, and I'm very thankful for that experience, because it really keeps you very much open to however it develops, to what's needed in order to put in place. And I think at the same time, the learning experience of going from such a structured environment to something where you wake up every day and you're not really sure what you're going to face, but really it's the approach that you have to systemize, has been a mindset change, but one that's been very rewarding and fruitful. I always say that I've learned more in 1 month at Madar than I would have a year, let's say, in any other kind of structured job.
Yeah, no, and I think, a lot of the audience will resonate with that, where, especially those that are probably doing both at the same time, the earlier stage founders where they have their 9-to-5 job, so to speak. And it's like in the office, they're very structured and everything is planned. And then in the evening when they're working on their startup, it's a little bit, chaotic, so to speak. But I think you highlighted a very important point in how the idea for Madar Farms came about, and that was focusing on the problem. So, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the specific ones that you saw in the UAE or the broader region, and then how those formulated into the idea for Madar Farms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off with kind of the big picture. We all know that there's a challenge, but it's really the scale and the imminence of the challenge that's terrifying. Less than 1% of land in the Gulf region is arable or permanent cropland. But despite that, over 80% of water use is for agriculture irrigation. This in a region where water is an incredibly precious resource, where it's incredibly intensive to get it out, and yet there seems to be this mismatch in how we're using it. Um, that with the fact that we're not really producing enough to feed anyone, to feed everyone. The quality at which we're seeing has been degrading as farming gets more industrialized, more commoditized over time, and just felt like there was a better way to go about addressing it. And I think focusing on that problem as a broad goal, and then slowly narrowing it down, more importantly, with inputs from other people. So it wasn't like we started Madar, without touching base, without speaking to customers, without speaking to the public sector, without getting out there in the community and speaking to people to understand, okay, this is a problem. If we propose solution A or B or C, what would it look like? And would that be something that you would join us on the journey for? I think being able to refine our solution alongside the problem, but with input, was perhaps the most important thing. Today, we're very much focused on not only just farming, but as an example, we're very much focused on raising education and awareness levels. Because we've discovered that one of the big challenges alongside what I've just described is actually the lack of awareness around how bad this challenge is, around what can we do to move the needle in terms of these numbers. What can we do to really create change? And that can only happen in cooperation with really everybody in the ecosystem. And when you're starting at a level where most people are unaware or unknowledgeable about what can be done, there comes that responsibility to do something alongside that. And that's why, as an example, we've focused so much on education to the point where we actually have a curriculum called Sustainable Futures that we launch in schools, and kids get to learn about agriculture and AgTech and sustainability, and they actually get to farm themselves, and they get to grow in a very similar way to the way we grow. So I think that it's not just a question of refining the problem statement, but also making sure that your solution is not done in tunnel vision, that it's not done kind of independently, that it's something that's tied in with what the needs for that intervention is.
Absolutely, I think, and part of the reason I think why we were also very interested to do this webinar was more on the education side, where agri-tech is not. I mean, I know this will resonate with you that it's not the first thing that comes up. When we're talking about the investable industries or the really big ones, in this region. And I think for that purpose, it'd be really useful if you could just maybe give a brief about what exactly Madar is offering in terms of, let's say, solutions, or like you touched on the educational side as well, because I think it'd be useful for the audience to perhaps find some avenues to learn more about, the overall landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk first off about just briefly the technology or the way that we go about growing and what advantages that gives us. So we're very focused on indoor farming and controlled environment agriculture. Now, those are just very big terms for saying that instead of growing outdoors, we grow in a fully indoor environment. So that means that our rooms in our farms, if you will, are almost like a clean room or a hospital, because we have multiple steps before you can get into the farm. We take extra care when it comes to sanitation. We take extra care when it comes to safety, because by being indoors, we eliminate the need for stuff like pesticides or insecticides or the chemicals that otherwise are needed to kind of combat that outdoor environment or compensate for a harsher environment. But more than that, we also utilize hydroponics. What that means, it means it's growing in water, not soil. The nutrients are delivered more efficiently, but more importantly, we're not dependent on land. We're not dependent on a fertile soil or a limitation on farmland. We can really grow anywhere. And so that addresses the land challenge issue. At the same time, by going indoors, we no longer have access to sunlight because we're completely closed off. While we don't look at that as a hindrance, we look at it as an opportunity. Because instead of sunlight, we use LED lights, where plants, they don't actually use all the sunlight that's coming to them. They only use certain colors of the white light that they're getting, certain wavelengths. And so we can customize the LEDs to be optimized for that particular crop. And so we're able to increase our nutritional density, we're able to grow faster. And what ends up happening by being in such a controlled environment where we're controlling oxygen, we're controlling carbon dioxide, temperature, all the things that you need to grow, is we give the plants exactly the environment they need 24/7. So you end up with produce that's a lot healthier, that's a lot more sustainable because we're recycling all of our water. And at the same time, that's land agnostic and can produce in places that you couldn't before. And so for us, we're very focused on taking that, developing it through our R&D, developing new crop varieties, new ways of going about that. Once we're done with the research and development, that's a big portion of our business. We focus on the commercial growing. So as an example, today you can buy our salad packs or our greens online. We'll be on retail shelves soon. Very excitedly, at the end of this year, we'll be opening the world's largest indoor tomato farm using LED lights. And so that's our commercial growing, where we take our knowledge and we deploy it at a much larger scale. But none of that can happen without the third pillar of our business, which is education. So Sustainable Futures, as I mentioned, is a curriculum we've developed, but we also have an inbound location at Masdar City where we run workshops, students, families, anyone can really come in, walk around and see different AgTech solutions and the way that you can live in a sustainable home. So really when we think about Madar, it's not only about developing the knowledge because it's a new industry, not only about deploying the knowledge, but it's about making it more accessible. Because the more accessible we make it, the wider we can drive adoptability. And by doing that, that's how we can really succeed.
It's very interesting that, I mean, it's like you said, it's kind of three different aspects that come together to kind of create that ecosystem where you're not just providing a solution. So firstly, you're developing that solution because, like you mentioned, this environment isn't the most optimal for growing crops and things like that. And then it's about providing that solution and then also the education side of things. So on the part of developing the solution, right, I'd like to jump in there a little bit deeper because it's, we often get asked by founders a lot, how do I develop my product? What's kind of the process that we should approach? And we always talk about, iteration and getting feedback and all of those things, but maybe especially in your case, because the solution is not so clear to begin with, right? Some challenges you just haven't faced before. So how did you, or how does your R&D team approach that challenge when it comes to product development?
Sure. So I think one of the important things to flag about our industry in particular is that it's really early stage, regardless of where you are in the world. AgTech in general has been kind of emerging over the last few years, but indoor farming hasn't really been deployed at large scale anywhere in the world. We've seen some examples, but nothing really at the scale at which we need here in the region. And so what we have to do is very much original towards this region, towards this environment. And that's something that's being done from scratch. We don't really have resources that we can lean on. And so instead of thinking about, kind of recreating the wheel or looking at other approaches, what we've very much done is said, look, the fastest way for us to learn is just go about doing it. I remember when we first started, I think our license was awarded in March. By end of April, early May, we had our first harvest. And the point of that was to be able to take it to the customer, was to be able to get their feedback, but at the same time, able to go to the public sector, understand what processes needed to be in place, internally speaking, documenting everything we did, and then asking yourself the question every single week, what could we have done better this time? And over time, it's very much just an iterative process of doing it again and again and again, but making sure it's guided by the question of how could we have done this better? Over time, we've managed to increase yields, create better quality products, but also widen the type of products that we offer. And the most beautiful thing about that is we're starting from a very low level, at a global stage. But as that knowledge gets built up, the product development tends to accelerate over time. And so that process of product development tends to become faster and easier, especially as you build the ties with the community, with the customer over time.
Interesting. And so, I mean, what I'm kind of getting out of what you just talked about is it's, even though it's a very, let's say, innovative solution that you're developing, it still has that same process that you would for, any software-based startup, any website, hardware startup, where it's having those honest conversations that, okay, what we've developed, it's working, but it may not be the best, and how do we improve, and working with your stakeholders to do that. So that's a really key point on the education side, right? So you're developing the solutions with the stakeholders, let's say the government, food suppliers, all of that. On the education side of things, I mean, and this is something personally I question as well. What's the difference if I buy something which is, let's say, not organic versus organic? Is there a difference? Is there not a difference? Because I mean, for me, I love food, to be honest. So as long as I have it, it's kind of okay with me. But please do elaborate a little bit. Are there differences as an end user between, let's say, the produce that you're offering versus what you would get in a grocery store?
Sure. Be careful what you wish for, Isham. I've been told in no uncertain terms by my wife that since I've started teaching her about this, that she's gotten so picky at the supermarket. So be careful what you wish for. Look, I think one of the most frequent questions we get is, do you grow organic? Organic as a label and as a certification has become a lot more popular over the years, and people have started to equate it with high quality. Um, whether that means good for you, whether that means good for the environment. There is this concept that organic is better because it's natural, it's from nature. Unfortunately, over the years, the term organic has kind of stretched and been misused or misrepresented, I think, over time. Because organic in one country or one jurisdiction does not mean the same as another. And we don't yet have that kind of standardized terminology or filtration for organic. And so what that means is that one organic product can differ entirely from another organic product, even though they might be the same vegetable. On top of that, organic really means that you grow in animal soil or animal fecal matter. And so that's a definition that's quite difficult for people who grow the way we do to get, because by growing in hydroponics, you don't have any soil. You're not limited to the land, you're growing in water. So that automatically takes it away. I think for us, what we focus much more so on is not the fact that, organic still uses insecticides and pesticides, and we don't, and a lot of people in the industry have used the term organic 2.0. We focus on the fact that it's local. Our farm can be delivered to you pretty much anywhere in the UAE in the space of hours. So farm to shelf or farm to fork is very much a real offering here. And so I think that value of being local, of being able to know exactly where your food is coming from, exactly how it's grown, is becoming more important over time. And we're actually seeing it adjust consumer habits at the market. So if I was sitting in your shoes and I was thinking about where do I want to eat, I think the number one thing I would look at is local.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point. So, I mean, if, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood correctly, the way you're, growing it, it doesn't significantly have a different nutritional value, so to speak, right? It's, I mean, as a tomato is a tomato, if I understood, right? Or not?
So that's actually a really nice thing that you bring up, and was a very nice surprise for us, because we were very much focused on sustainability, on conserving the water resources. In our farms, we are anywhere between 95 to 99% more water efficient, if you will, than your outdoor farms. I think for us, the nice surprise was when you give the plants exactly what they need, when they need it, they're not really fighting to kind of grow. They're not really fighting to get that nutrition. They're just kicking back, relaxing, and focused on being them. And what ends up happening is we like to say happier plants end up being better plants. So we've seen levels of, for example, beta carotene be much, much higher because they're able to dedicate that resource to the development. I think also more importantly is if you think about just a human being, if you give them the optimal environment, their body will develop at a much better pace as they grow than if they were eating junk food or they were not sleeping right or whatever behavioral patterns are. You can think of plants in very much the same way. So they do actually have a higher concentration of nutritional value.
Interesting. That's, I mean, and I think that that kind of adds to the element that you were talking about, where about supporting local. So to that end, I would also like to add another dimension to the discussion of pricing. A lot of the times, maybe the assumption is that because so many innovative technologies are being used, as an end user, you just assume, oh, it must be more expensive than what you're used to getting in the grocery store. So does price play a part in your efforts? Is that something you're focusing on, or at the moment, because you're just 2 years 3 years into the business, is it more about the technology for now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with Madar, one of our vision statements is driving accessibility. So price accessibility is definitely something that's on our mind. However, we try not to compete on price. We try to compete on value because the way that we guide our decisions is very much along the lines of how can we move the needle in terms of food security? How can we increase local production? How can we decrease water dependence? Those are our guiding factors. So our target is to displace imports. And when you're looking at the import market and when you're looking at the prices that it takes, not only that it's growing out somewhere very far away, but the transportation cost, the cost of putting the preservatives in there, the cost of getting it on the shelf. There's so much cost saving in getting it from A to B that we're actually able to compete very well, even on a price point with imports. And our current goal is to start to displace those imports and decrease our percentage of imports. Now, over time, when we think about widening our product range, accessibility is definitely something that filters what we choose. We like to say we can grow almost anything in the method that we do, but in order to drive their uptake, we need to make sure that they're price feasible as well, both externally and internally. So it's not a blanket question that I can apply across all products, but given our target, it's something that we feel very comfortable with. And I'll flag just one thing, Hisham, just on your earlier point, even you were surprised at what I just said. I think that highlights the aspect of education and awareness. I think with a lot of people, once they start becoming more aware, it affects their consumer habits, it affects their purchasing habits, their decisions at the supermarket. And when those decisions start to change, that's when retailers, that's when people start to listen and start to shift. I think what we've seen now is this increase in demand around local in particular because of the fear of transmission of things internationally with transport. And as we see that shift happen, we're seeing retailers adjust their offering. We're seeing more local presence in markets, but that's the point. It really starts and ends with the community.
Absolutely. And I think, I was definitely a little surprised when you told me, especially about the nutritional aspect. I'm not just an expert in eating food. I also like to, take a little interest in the nutrition side of things. So, maybe we can take a couple of minutes as well to highlight some of the things that, you're working on from the educational side. So, people hear these terms like food security, water security. When I'm in a grocery store, what should I be looking out for, to be honest, when it comes to buying my, produce or vegetables? Are there certain things, that we should try to avoid when we're doing our weekly shop?
Sure. So why don't we break down the terms first, right?
Yeah.
So water and food security means sustainability of access, that you have a resource that you will always have access to in a way that's sustainable, that you're not destroying your long-term production methods out of that. Second part of it is that it's accessible. is that a person can actually go about purchasing it or getting access to it somehow. And of course, the third part is very importantly localizing it. And I think that's the term that people kind of connotate the most importantly with that. So the easiest, I would say, shift that a person can make is buying local. If you think about, we have this concept that import might be better, that import is higher quality. But if you think about the fact that that vegetable or that plant has traveled halfway across the planet just to get to you, and you think about the amount of chemicals or preservatives that have been pumped into that to have it looking as gleaming and as fresh as it does at the supermarket. I mean, if you take a flight from Europe, the first thing you want to do when you get home is take a shower. Can you imagine what the plants and vegetables feel like? So I think shopping local is the easy one. The second thing that I think was kind of a big surprise in our household was really the chemical factor. If you look at something that's been produced at a very different date, or if you look at something that doesn't quite feel right or doesn't quite look right, you can look at the back and you could look at the nutritional information and some of the chemicals that have been used. We always try to buy local, we always try to buy fresh because that also means that the likelihood of those chemicals being used, I wouldn't say it's gone, but it's very much decreased. Um, and I think finally, obviously, is making sure that if there is an option where it's grown sustainably. The UAE recently launched the UAE Sustainable Label. Um, Being able to understand that when you're buying something, you're not contributing to the problem, that whatever you're buying is actually encouraging the retailer to shift towards sustainable production methods with their partners, I think is very important. But not to overcomplicate it, the number one thing you can do when you go to market is just buy and ask for local.
Definitely. And I think it might be also, kind of important to highlight that even I think within your household as well, probably these changes didn't happen overnight. I think it was, gradual changes. That okay, one trip you maybe buy a certain vegetable or a certain produce, and then slowly and steadily. And I mean, do you think that's the right way to go about it? I mean, in the sense where we're all used to a certain way of life, especially when it comes to food. So, like, is that how you adopted the change, within your family?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's doing anything and changing an entire lifestyle overnight is always unsustainable.
Yeah.
When we talk about ingrained behaviors, when we talk about assumptions, I mean, you ask most children today here, where do vegetables come from? And they're going to name a supermarket. They're not going to talk about the farm, right?
Yeah.
How do you combat those decades really of concepts that have been ingrained in us? And so small, tiny habits are the best way to build up to a big habit. I think as well, though, we're very lucky in this country that we have so many dining options and so much information available that you can do one with the other. Maybe buy a new vegetable, but also learn a little bit about it, learn a little bit about where it's coming from, look at how it's being used. Um, the evidence they always say is kind of in the food. I think when you start to try something new and it tastes better, but then you reinforce it by knowing that it's coming from a better place or that you're contributing to a sort of change, those habits over time will become ingrained. I think it's not just about your shopping habits, but just becoming more aware. And there's so many resources online. We post stuff all the time, and we'd be happy if anyone's looking for it to give them guidance about more resources. But it really is just boiling down to educating yourself and make a small change every few days.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, you rightly pointed out that it's education matters before action. Swapping out your weekly grocery is the action, but you need to be first aware of it. Before I kind of change the conversation a little bit into the trends, I just want to recap a little bit for the audience some of the things that we talked about so far. So firstly, the shift from corporate to entrepreneurship is very much possible, as Abdulaziz said. More importantly, it's about seeing that problem and the scope of the problem before you even start developing the solution. Understand what it is, how it affects the various stakeholders, and then apply a very iterative, feedback-oriented product development process, and most importantly, along the way, try to educate yourself about whatever industry or whatever problem you're trying to solve. Abdulaziz, I want to bring in now kind of the more trends that you're seeing within this space. With COVID, I think it's kind of highlighted the need to increase investment, I suppose, in AgriTech. If I remember correctly, Abu Dhabi Investment Office invested in a couple of AgriTech startups as well. So can you talk to us about what are you seeing will be, at the forefront? Aspiring entrepreneurs, what are some of the things that they could look into potentially as well, right, within this industry?
Sure, absolutely. So taking a step back from COVID first, when we started in 2017, the space was dead. There really wasn't very much interest in it. We felt very, if you will, intellectually lonely. We felt like we were pounding the table and there wasn't many people willing to listen, if you will. Everyone thought it was this great idea, but how do you convince them to come along for the ride? And what we saw over the years, however, is this increasing importance put on it, primarily driven, I think, by consumer trends, but also by the public sector. So I remember when we first started, the license didn't even exist for what we're doing. Today, you can go and apply for it and receive it same day under the Advanced Agriculture License that was newly created. We saw Abu Dhabi Investment Office set up a AgTech program worth $1 billion as its first round, and they've already dispersed into 4 companies, including ours, the first round of $100 million, for a space that hasn't had that dedicated support first before. This is historical. We have a Minister of Food Security and the world's first Ministry of Food Security. That kind of focus and that kind of support, we're in an area of greatest need, but it also means it's a time of greatest opportunity, especially with that level of support. With COVID, what shifted, I think, was the focus of the community as well. And when those two things happen at the same time, it was very much a beautiful moment in the sense of demand very much ticked up for local products, for things that people knew were safe. As an example, our farm is HACCP certified. COVID hasn't really had an impact on our operations other than breaking up shifts. But for years, if you walk into our farm, you've got to put on your gloves, your mask, your lab coat, your URL, you have to sign a health disclaimer form. These are just some of our basic standard operating procedures. And when people find that out, they discover it almost as a surprise. But that's really been the change, is that people are suddenly looking for answers in cooperation with the space support. And really some of the questions that we're seeing is around safety, is around where my food is coming from, is around how it's growing, and looking for better alternatives. So the space is very much wide. A lot of the time when we speak to people, they think it has to be like something what we do, and it absolutely doesn't. There are still major challenges across the value chain. One of the big applications that we've seen be really successful recently is blockchain. People want to know exactly where their food is coming from, and this provides a transparent understanding from start to finish about where it's coming from, about what's included in it. The industry we're in requires a lot of inputs, and because it's a brand new industry, not only globally, but not only regionally, but also globally, there's a gap in suppliers. With everything that we do, there's new opportunities coming up, whether that's in the education space, whether that's in the software space. And it doesn't necessarily also have to be an entire initiative. The skill sets that are starting to be looked for, one of the challenges we have is finding the right people with the right qualifications or experiences, if you will, because there hasn't been an opportunity to develop them before. And the breadth of people we're looking at now, something like a data analyst, for example, is not something you would have typically associated with agriculture either. So I think that if I was talking to the audience and someone was thinking about, I want to get involved, how can I do so? It would really start with understand the problem, find a portion of the problem in the value chain, and think about ways of addressing it. The biggest trend really that's coming up is food, full stop, agriculture, full stop. There is no specific, if you will, nuance around it, or there's opportunity only here or here. We're coming from such, unfortunately, a low level, But the blessing of that is there's so much opportunity for improvement and for impact and for people to get involved.
Definitely. And I think it's no surprise that the government here is really supporting this as well. The UAE has always been early to spot those important trends and then provide that support. And I think you rightly pointed out that because it's an up and coming industry, if you will, the opportunities are endless when it comes to starting businesses, solving those problems. And I hope that our conversation so far has inspired a little bit the audience to at least educate themselves a little bit more about the problems.
And Hisham, if I can just jump in there,
Yeah,
one
sure.
message that I really want to send is the fact that I mentioned before, there is no big player in this space, but there is no big player in a lot of other parts of the value chain either. There is no Netflix, there is no Google. And part of our, if you will, recipe for success has been the fact that we are local, we are from here, we are developing this originally on the ground. And that's been a huge contributor to our success because all of our solutions are tailored exactly for these problems that we're facing here. And that's something that I would encourage people to think about is when an industry is at so early stage globally, you really have an opportunity to turn this region and this country into a center of excellence. You don't have to follow any method done abroad. You don't have to follow an intervention done abroad. Think about what problems we're facing here and what we can do for it here. And we can one day start to have a conversation about how do we export these processes? How do we export these ideals abroad? And that's an opportunity that I don't think we've seen in a space as much as we've seen in AgTech here in the region.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you said, because some of the international ecosystems are a little bit more advanced than, where we are, a lot of the times we're bringing in the ideas a little bit from those ecosystems. But here there is a golden opportunity to develop those ideas and solutions locally and then export them globally. We have a couple of questions that I'd like to get your take on as well. And I think one of them is an important one because I think a lot of founders face this in different industries where there are traditional players in that industry that exist, and it's like, oh, but how can a startup compete with them, right? So I know you said that at least from a solution perspective, there aren't any big players, but at least in the food space, I'm pretty sure there are. So how did you go about that when you were going to market with Madar?
Sure. There's a few approaches here, but really, especially in food and agriculture, when you talk about competitive landscape, you can almost say everyone, though that's not the right business thing to do. You are really brushing up against an entire ecosystem. I think it really starts first off with the challenge itself. If the problem and the challenge is strong enough that it's affecting an entire community, then everyone's going to be feeling it. And if you come up with a solution that is appropriate enough or that's going to create enough impact, there's enough of that impact to be shared around. And that's a way that you can turn those competitors into partners. When we think about the way that we're doing what we do, we don't really focus on, am I going to be hurting this person, am I going to be hurting that person? The problem is so big that there's enough space for us to enter, but there's also enough space for us to partner up with people who might not be obvious partners that will actually end up accelerating us. And I think it really starts with finding the right challenge and finding the right approach. Another aspect I would say very, very important here is you should never dissuade yourself based on what's happening externally. If you're passionate enough about what you do, and you have a vision that can rally an entire team that's as passionate, then it really is a process of problem solving every single day. At some point, these incumbents are not really going to be thinking of you, and one day they will be. But by that point, you hopefully have enough development under your belt and enough of the team that you can approach that problem one by one. If you delay your kind of progress from the outset because of a fear of an incumbent response, then you're never really going to start in the first place. Disruption and change will only happen when you start to challenge the status quo. You can't be afraid of saying that this is a problem and I can do it better than anyone else can address it. And finally, I would say, and this is incredibly, incredibly important, is don't, people have a tendency to overly focus on the negative, but you would be surprised if you kind of open up your arms a little bit and open up conversations, how many allies and supporters you would find. I think one of the greatest surprises we found was it's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody, for them to come to the farm, for them to see what we're doing and not say that they want to help somehow, that they want to be involved. And that, alhamdulillah, has been such a blessing for us. But that's because the problem that we're addressing is it's directly helping these same people. And we found allies in the most unlikely of corners. We found supporters and partners in the most unlikely of corners. And I think keeping up that arms open mind and open aspect, you know, it'll end up being a recipe for success.
Absolutely. I think, and that's a really important point that you brought up about, you know, viewing these, you know, existing players in that space as, you know, partners that want to help rather than as competition, because like you said, it's such a big space. We have another question, and I think this is also an interesting one because from a startup perspective, you know, especially that you've been developing your own technology, how do you kind of balance the internal R&D with the external promotion of what you're doing, you know? And I'm sure the underlying question is like, how did you manage the funding for it, basically, right? So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think there are actually two separate questions, so I'll address the first one. In terms of, first off, we couldn't go straight to sales because we had no idea what we were doing. It's as simple as that. You know, as great as our first harvest was, we've come miles away when we compare what it is today. And that's something that's just going to happen with time. And by always having that feedback loop that I spoke about with customers earlier on, potential customers, that's going to inform you about when you're ready for sales, about when you're ready to take the next step, because it really is dependent on market development, product development. At the same time, I think you also have to be aware that in our industry, again, because we're coming from such a low baseline, there is a lot of work that has to be done before you're ready to be customer facing. And it's very important to be realistic about what your milestones are before you go on, before you kind of go on the journey, and having clear targets that you need to achieve before you can kind of activate, all right, I want to start getting the message out there. All right, I want to start to spread out sales a bit. A constant struggle that I have with the team is I kind of want to hold back. I want to do more product development. I want to see more things. The team's like, no, we got to get this out there. And having that feedback loop, not just externally, but also internally, always questioning yourself of, all right, guys, this month, what was right, what was wrong? Always having that conversation is very important to positioning right and to not missing opportunity. I think in terms of counterbalancing that out with funding and with investment, finding your initial, let's call it supporter or stakeholder, is incredibly important. When we first started, and our first investor who came in, we were incredibly lucky that he had such a long-term vision alongside us and was aware that at least for 1.5 to 2 years, we would just be tinkering around in a farm. Having that realistic expectation set, aligned with the right investor, the right stakeholder, gave us room to build a foundation that's much stronger down the road. Today, because of the time that we've spent looking at the different growing, looking at the different products, we're able to scale much faster than we would have been otherwise. But moreover, the risk weighting we have for that scale is much lower because we've done it before at a very small scale, and we're looking at replicating that indoor environment. And so for us, when we think about scaling up and then thinking about the extra resources we would need, it's also very much validated by stuff that's been done before. So tying your long-term goals backwards and informing your milestones with that is incredibly important. And I think finally, you know, today, Madar, we have multiple offices. We're building a very large facility, and obviously the scale at which we're doing what we do is very different than where we were a couple of years ago. But just to be clear, you know, when we first started, we were in a sand plot, and it was me and, you know, one person, and then me and two, and then me and three for like a good 1.5 to 2 years before we even started bulking up the team. You know, we were in a place where, you know, we'd be embarrassed if someone visited us, asked us for a washroom because it wasn't really available. But you know what? It was dirt cheap. And we managed to get the most amount of knowledge we could with the leanest team and the leanest overhead. And that's something that's also very important, is counterbalancing what is the 80-20 approach of getting the data or the input or the output from the research that you need while being as lean as possible to get that. I think having that mindset early on, tying it with milestones, tying it with the right stakeholder long term, and making sure you can validate that trust, I think is the recipe for success here.
Absolutely. I think you kind of just like, summarized the venture building side of things really nicely, where because that's, something that we as part of our programs really try to push forward as well, is the mindset of having very clear milestones. Money from any investor is not always the answer. You have to find, it's a partnership, it's a relationship, and that's really important. Like you said, it's always about starting as lean as possible, getting those learnings, iterating, and then building your product. Before we wrap up, I just have like two more questions that would be interesting to get your perspective on. So one of them is, why do you think there continues to be a lack of awareness of the sustainable side of the products that you're offering? Or, I mean, do you see that changing? Like, do you see, I mean, obviously compared to 2 years ago, certainly the education side has increased. People are more aware, but do you see that trend continuing, or do you still see that it's like people are still quite unaware when it comes to sustainable food?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say that not only do we see the trend continuing, we probably see it accelerating. The number of conversations we've had, especially since COVID, around food safety, food health, and nutrition has increased dramatically. I think people have become a lot more self-reflective, a lot more aware of what are we putting into our bodies. It's the one thing we have for our entire life. We got to take better care of it. And I think understanding as well that sometimes we're going to be on our own. How do we become and build a resilient system? Um, you know, what's important here is not the pace of questioning, but also to make sure that it's the right knowledge, that it's the right information that's being put out there. There is an establishment bias because there is an industry that's been around for a very long time that's used to doing stuff in a certain way. And being able to put out the right sources of information, being able to put out something that is tangible that people can go and verify and check, that's part of the reason why we've invested so much in our educational practice. That's why we've invested so much in getting people at our centers, going out to them, is because it's incredibly important to kind of move through the noise. I think also what'll be beautiful is we're seeing so many entrants and so many different methods. And so we should be able to have more voices on the supply side. When we have more voices, we're hopefully not screaming as much into a vacuum, and that conversation can happen much more holistically. So we have incredibly high hopes for the future, but honestly, it really starts with conversations and opportunities like this. And hopefully the audience can go away and reflect on it, but also spread the message to other people.
Absolutely. And it's exciting to see, like I said, the industry is really up and coming now. The spotlight is on it. So to that end, what's next for Madar? What should we looking out for? Any revolutionary technology that you'd like to announce on this webinar before we wrap up?
You know what? COVID for us was a learning experience because we used to only sell to hotels and restaurants pre-COVID. Our sales went to zero overnight because they all shut down. So we had to learn very fast. We had our plans kind of in the background ready, but we switched to direct to consumer in 10 days. That was, a blessing in disguise because it was something that we were a bit hesitant to do, but we did it. It's been going great. You can find our products for the first time online and direct to retail. We'll be on retail shelves very soon. And at the end of the year, please come visit us in PZ. We'll be building the world's largest indoor tomato farm. We're super excited about that. And it'll be really the first time that people can move around between the farm and education center and have that overall approach. But look, Hisham, there's one message I want to leave with people. I feel sometimes when we have conversations like this, we can reflect it to be a little bit more polished than it actually is. If there's a message I want to send to people is, the amount of struggle we've had to get to this point, the variety of the challenges we've faced, and err from the incredibly inane and stupid that might take time to the incredibly complicated that need, a strategic overview. It's just, you never know what you're going to face. And any success we've had is, I think, from the support of the community, is putting together an incredible team. If you're passionate and you have a vision that people can get passionate around, the commitment that you can get from the team is overwhelmingly supportive. But finally, I think, is having the can-do attitude. We face the challenge, and it really has come almost like a mantra of the next 3 months are going to be the hardest, the next 3 years are going to be great. I feel like ever since we've started, we've kept saying that over and over again, but it gets us from point A to point B to point C. And if people are thinking about starting the journey, just go ahead and do it, because you don't know what's going to come up. The one thing that you can control is your response to it.
Absolutely. I think, I think from like my perspective, entrepreneurship is never easy. It's just that we see these success stories on social media and all of this, and suddenly it's like, it's, it's, uh, it's a walk in the park, so to speak, but it's never like that. But I think you rightly pointed out is to kind of believe firstly in what you're doing and the problem you're trying to solve. And secondly, it's the support of the people around you, the ecosystem, the stakeholders, which matters a lot. I really appreciate your time, Abdulaziz. Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. To our audience, always appreciated that you join us. It's the support that you guys give that really, make us want to keep doing and keep putting out content like this. We will put a feedback form in the webinar chat. Please do fill it out. We'd like to hear your thoughts on today's webinar, what more you'd like to see, what are the different topics. And yeah, like I said, really happy to have you on board today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Very much. Thank you, Hisham. It's really good to have an extended conversation. So thanks to you and Shirah for putting this together, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Hopefully they found something interesting that they can leave with.
I hope so too. And until the next webinar, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll meet again next week.